What if we could actually make it mathematically impossible for leaders to profit from war? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we are unpacking a really urgent, deeply researched blueprint for global survival. It's called the Conscience Ultimatum. It's a scientific and legal framework for 21st century peace governance, conceptualized by Professor Kapil Mishra. You know, if you've ever looked at the state of global conflict and just wondered why our international institutions seem so utterly powerless to stop it, this framework offers a completely new way of thinking about state power, accountability, and how we might systematically enforce peace.
To really get why Professor Mishra's blueprint is so incredibly urgent right now, we kind of have to face the staggering reality of the year 2025. That single year saw roughly 244,600 deaths from organized violence. I mean, just think about that number for a second. That makes it the second deadliest year for global conflict since the 1994 Rwandan genocide. It's just a stark, undeniable reminder that our current systems of conflict deterrence are literally failing to protect human life.
And alongside that immense human tragedy, the economic drain was, well, it was nothing short of apocalyptic. The global economic impact of violence in 2025 reached an estimated $21.8 trillion. That staggering figure is roughly 10.5% of the entire world's wealth. We are literally spending a massive fraction of our global resources on our own destruction. And remember, that cost ripples down to all of us, right? It hits us through global inflation, strained local economies, and an unbelievably heavy burden on everyday taxpayers.
On top of all that, these escalating state-based conflicts drove a record-breaking wave of human displacement. By the end of 2025, 117.8 million people were forcibly uprooted from their homes due to violence and persecution. To put that into perspective, you're looking at roughly 1 in every 70 people on planet Earth being forced to flee.
When you stack up the numbers for what the framework calls the calculus of calamity, our global priorities are genuinely shocking. The $9.5 trillion spent on global military and internal security represents this massive, almost incomprehensible outpouring of resources. Now compare that to $4.2 trillion. That much smaller figure? That's the entire financing gap needed to actually achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals in developing nations. Basically, our investment in global military capacity completely, absolutely eclipses our investment in global development and stability.
Okay, so that brings us to the first core concept of the framework: awakened sovereignty, and how we redefine state legitimacy. To reverse this deeply flawed trajectory we're on, Professor Mishra introduces a total paradigm shift in how we view state power. Awakened sovereignty dictates that a government's legitimacy shouldn't just be judged by the physical territory it happens to control. Instead, it absolutely must be judged by whether its institutions are inclusive, lawful, and genuinely protective of its people. Simply put, it argues that the right to rule is fundamentally tied to the duty to protect.
Think of it this way. The old rule of international law treated sovereignty like an unconditional shield. A state could do whatever it wanted within its borders, externalizing destruction onto its own civilians without facing outside interference. But the new rule, under awakened sovereignty, redefines power as a conditional trust. You earn the right to sovereign legitimacy by protecting and including your population. And if that trust is violated, well, there has to be a real diplomatic price to pay.
Moving on to part 2, we have the namesake of the entire framework, the Conscience Ultimatum, which is all about institutionalizing restraint.
So how do we make this conditional trust actually work in the real world without having to fire a single bullet or wait around for a paralyzed UN Security Council? Professor Mishra proposes what he calls the Global Mirror Protocol. This mechanism essentially forces sovereign powers to face their own reflection by making the true human and economic costs of war inescapably visible on the global stage. It completely shifts the strategic game theory of conflict. The goal is to make the reputational and diplomatic cost of choosing war so incredibly high that restraint just becomes the only logical, self-interested choice.
The crucial point here is correcting a massive, systemic injustice in human behavior, which the framework calls the shame asymmetry principle. Historically, the elites and leaders who order war bear the absolute least direct cost, right? They capture the political gains while externalizing all the gruesome human and economic toll onto everyday civilians. The Conscience Ultimatum is specifically designed to re-internalize those devastating costs right back onto the decision makers.
So how does it actually pull that off? It uses 3 main tools. First, a living cost broadcast. This is a daily, institutionally verified broadcast of casualties and economic loss. Second, a named accountability index, which is a permanent public record tracking the specific leaders who prolong conflict when peaceful alternatives are sitting right there. And third, a peace dividend redirection accord, which is a voluntary framework that rewards states for redirecting their military budgets toward development. Together, these tools translate reputational shame into severe, inescapable financial consequences.
Next up in Part 3, we're looking at peace impact assessments and the idea of forcing upfront disclosure before conflict even starts.
To actually implement this kind of upfront disclosure, especially today, when autonomous AI systems are literally compressing military decisions from days down to mere seconds, the blueprint proposes a really brilliant legal innovation. Much like we legally require an environmental impact assessment to disclose ecological costs before a company can build a massive dam, a peace impact assessment would require public disclosure before military action. Triggered by a third-party request, a state would have to publicly estimate expected civilian casualties and economic loss before troops or drones are ever deployed. You might not prevent every single action, but you entirely remove the excuse that catastrophic consequences were somehow unforeseeable.
All right, Part 4 covers what happens after the fighting stops, the 5-year peace covenant, which is a time-bound pathway to stability.
Because here's the thing, once the fighting finally halts, fragile societies desperately need structure to make peace truly durable. Looking at recent stalled peace processes in places like Colombia, Yemen, and South Sudan, Professor Mishra noted a really dangerous disconnect called symbolic compliance. Conflicting parties would satisfy procedural calendar deadlines on paper, basically just ticking the boxes as time passed, while completely ignoring the substantive stuff, like critical security reform or actual political dialogue.
To fix this, the 5-year peace covenant lays out a beautifully structured 4-phase pathway. It helps transition a fractured state through Phase 1, immediate cessation of hostilities. Phase 2, humanitarian reconstruction. Phase 3, structured dialogue on the actual root grievances. And finally, Phase 4, consolidation and review, which culminates in a democratic referendum.
And the absolute core game changer of this covenant is the concept of benchmark-gated progression. Moving from one phase to the next doesn't happen just because a certain date on the calendar rolls around. No, it only happens after independent, third-party verification of concrete institutional benchmarks. This completely prevents leaders from just running out the clock while quietly letting the peace deal fall apart behind the scenes.
Finally, Part 5 brings us to the ultimate choice we have to make: war's price versus the peace dividend.
This whole architecture we've talked about, awakened sovereignty, the Conscience Ultimatum, and the Peace Covenant, it basically brings humanity to an undeniable crossroads. By measuring what the blueprint calls the Net Peace Dividend Index, which is essentially the massive financial and social returns of maintaining stability, against the staggering costs of violence we looked at earlier, the math is incredibly clear. We can clearly see the tangible returns of redirecting military spending into global development, health, and infrastructure. It's a real mathematical way to transition the sword into time-bound, lasting peace.
As this explainer highlights, the theoretical and institutional tools for 21st century peace governance absolutely exist. We really don't have to accept endless cycles of conflict as some unchangeable law of nature. So, the final question I want to leave you with today is this: will we continue to blindly finance our own destruction, or will we finally demand the institutionalization of a true conscience ultimatum? Thanks so much for learning with me today.